So now we're ready to introduce our speaker, who is not a regular, but an intermittent warm friend of this seminar. And Margaret has a most interesting trajectory, born in Boston, Massachusetts, and now a senior professor at Uppsala in Sweden, where she tells me her Swedish is really pretty good, including for research purposes. Very impressive. And Margaret is also not only jumping across the continents, but also interdisciplinary figure. She has degrees in music, theology, and history. Bravo, pretty impressive combination. And among her recent work, 3 items to report to you: an article in Past and Present on naval pay, including its effect on women's living standards in maritime London in the 17th century into the up until mid-18th century, that's maritime London. Secondly is a digital handbook on Scandinavian shipping that are recorded in the prize papers in Britain's National Archive. And given that trade between Scandinavia and Britain was very extensive, you can imagine this is quite a substantial database. And the third point to draw to your attention is an article and, in fact, contribution to the editorial work of a very, very interesting book published by CUP in 2023 called The Whole Economy, which is about women and gender in the economies of early modern Europe. So that's a pretty snazzy CV, and now no pressure, but we're ready for a snazzy paper.
It's really always a pleasure to be here. And it's partly the people, it's partly the intellectual excitement. It's great to be here. So it's not every day that one finds a large collection of 17th century plebeian letters, much less unopened ones. But one has recently come to light from 1696. These letters, now in the National Archives at Kew, part of the prize papers, which we just mentioned, were generated by sailors from a number of Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian ships. Let's see, can we get this to work? Or... Work a second ago.
Now where do we end up? Okay. So now we've gone away from the screen. I do hate. Yeah. Okay. Now that should work.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Perfect. Good. These letters were generated by sailors from a number of Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian ships that had gotten trapped in Plymouth Harbor by bad weather and contrary winds. So there is a English, at least, aspect to this paper. Adding to the glut of Scandinavians in Plymouth Harbor, a flag dispute in the Channel between the Swedes and the English in late December of 1695 had ended with a Swedish warship getting detained for several weeks at Plymouth, along with her entire convoy, while the diplomats negotiated their release. With little to do but wait, many sailors seized the opportunity to send letters home to their families and friends. Between the 13th and 20th of January 1696, around 80 men wrote or dictated some 100 letters, all destined for Denmark, Norway, or Sweden. The letters were then consigned to a Danish flyboat called the Saint Jacob in Danish, which had just come from Bordeaux with a cargo of wine and was headed north for Elsinore and Copenhagen. On the 30th of January, while the Saint Jacob was still lying at anchor in Plymouth, the crew of an English Navy fire ship seized her and her rich cargo as a potential prize, despite the fact that Denmark was a neutral power. They also confiscated the packet of letters, presumably to use as evidence in prize court. Those letters would remain unopened among the High Court of Admiralty prize court records for the next 320 years. This talk focuses on a subset of this larger collection, consisting of 40 Sweden-bound letters sent by 35 non-elite sailors. The vast majority of the letters were directed to people in one of the 4 Swedish towns marked in red on this map. Karlskrona, to which the largest number of letters were consigned, Kalmar, Stockholm, and Gothenburg. So this talk has 2 parts. In the first part, I discuss late 17th century married sailors and their wives as an emotional and epistolary community. In the second part, I explore sailors' letter sending as a collective emotional ritual. In it, I take seriously the claim made by some historians of emotion that certain emotions have gone extinct or gotten lost, or at least have greatly changed their character over time. The sailors who sent these letters were about evenly divided between merchant sailors and Swedish Navy sailors. In most cases, we don't know the names of the merchant ships, most of which were probably small, but the Navy sailors were largely ordinary crew members from the warship Livland, which is the ship that had been involved in the flag incident. And there was a handful of under-officers from the same ship, mostly master gunners, called konstaplar in Swedish. They were probably, in most respects, a fairly representative group of sailors. However, one obvious way in which they were not representative was that 32 out of the 35 of the non-elite letter senders, 91%, were married men. Now, it is not easy to say with precision what the marriage rate was for Swedish sailors overall in the 17th century, but we can be confident that it was significantly lower than 91%. The latest attempt to quantify this, a study of merchant sailors by Aska Lorsen-Brock and Jelle van Lottem, actually based on examinations from the High Court of Admiralty, suggests that the marriage rate may have reached 58% for officers and was probably somewhere under 45%, or perhaps considerably under 45% for regular merchant seamen. There are no figures on the marriage rate for Navy sailors, but it is likely to have been lower, at least among the lower ranks, who tended to be both young and poor. Many of the latter, as Anna Sara Hammer observes in her Social History of the Early Modern Swedish Navy, quote, owned no land, no farm, and sometimes not even the clothes on their backs, which in a late marriage, low nuptiality country like Sweden is unlikely to have made them good prospects for matrimony. In earlier times, sailors must have kept in touch with their wives and families by word of mouth, taking advantage of the fact that the men often rotated between ships, particularly merchant sailors, and both men and ships moved frequently from port to port. By 1696, if these letters are any indication, a substantial proportion of this work of staying in touch was being done by letter. Certainly, there is no suggestion that the Plymouth Harbor letter-writing spree was unusual. Thus, 15 of the 35 sailors referred in their letters to other letters received or sent, or to be sent in future, or demonstrated in other ways that the sending of letters was not out of the ordinary. Martin Beck, probably a merchant sailor, reported to his wife that he had received her letter and also sent 2 back to her from Lund. Navigator Johann Steenvald, probably from a merchant ship, supplied his wife with a detailed account of letters sent and received since the voyage began. She sent 2, he sent 4. Master Gunner Burrish Spring of the Navy ship Livland detailed arrangements he had made for his wife to receive future letters via the Admiralty in Karlskrona. Karlskrona being, the reason there were so many letters there is that there was the Swedish Navy's premier base in the Baltic Sea. Here's a picture of it. Today, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site and very strongly recommended if you're ever in southern Sweden. Other men offered excuses for why they had not written. The wife of Bengt Kumas was asked via someone else's letter to forgive her husband for not writing to her because he had been unable to receive permission to do so. And probably he wasn't given leave to go out and find a scrivener to write the letter from him. The 1696 letter writers were also familiar enough with the post to have devised creative ways to cut costs. Thus, like many others, Jöns Mikkelson, a merchant sailor, bundled his letters and one from a crewmate into one envelope, then asked his wife to hand deliver the other woman's letter and split the postage costs with her. The 1696 corpus also demonstrates some of the ways letter sending could be accommodated to varying degrees of literacy. The majority of these married men would have had some familiarity with reading a printed page. This was because in order to marry in Sweden in the late 17th century, both the prospective spouses had to demonstrate an ability to read a passage from a printed religious text, most often Martin Luther's Small Catechism. This is an interesting difference from the British Isles. However, these new readers, as many of them must have been, were not necessarily comfortable with reading handwriting, and it is likely that a substantial proportion of them were unable to write, or at least not well enough to pen a letter. Resort to scriveners was widespread among these letter senders, and in at least 5 cases, we can also see that arrangements were made to have the letter read aloud to their wives on the other end by some literate person, such as a local shopkeeper. Clearly, the culture of letter sending was well developed in this occupational group, at least among married people, and it could and did extend to men and women who were functionally illiterate or at least unable to read handwriting. Letters are well known for their rigid rhetorical conventions, then as now, and certainly this was true of the 1696 letters. All of the 1696 letters have standardized openings and closings, as letters typically do. But in addition to this, passages in the body of many letters are close to identical across a number of other letters. They were not just produced by scriveners, but done on the cheap, which is part of the reason why they're so repetitive. Moreover, some scriveners clearly were working from templates, which they more or less successfully imposed on the men, especially the less literate ones who couldn't check what they were doing. Some of the letters may have been repetitive, but they stand out for their highly emotional style. Some of this was certainly conventional to the period. For example, it seems to have been virtually mandatory that the word hustru, or wife, almost wherever it appeared in a letter, and presumably in oral speech as well, be preceded with kära, dear, or some other word denoting affection. This was reinforced by frequent injunctions from the pulpit and other media to men to love their wives. Here's one of those, a piece of media. The book pictured here is the most popular Swedish household duties book of the later 17th century. It came out, in fact, in 1696. And it uses standard biblical passages, Ephesians chapter 5, which is men love your wives as Christ does the church, Genesis chapter 32, Mark chapter 10, to hammer home the message that marriage was indissoluble and that men should love and honor and lay down their lives for their wives. I would also note that apart from being in Swedish, it is almost indistinguishable from English family duty tracts of the 17th century, like, for example, William Gouge's Of Domestical Duties, and it could be exactly the same. You could have cribbed it from each other. And it's partly because they use the same biblical passages, particularly Ephesians. I am mostly not fixating on the Swedish language in this talk, but in preparation for the rest of the talk, I do have 3 Swedish phrases that I want you to learn, since I'll keep returning to them, and you can forget them again after the talk. The first of these, and there are 3, is Kära hustru, dear wife. So if you would repeat after me, Kära hustru. Very good, very nice. It'll be coming up again. Even so, many of the 1696 letter writers went well beyond the conventions, religious or otherwise, when it came to expressing affection for their wives. The most extreme example is a letter by one Samuel Baga, probably an under-officer on the Navy ship Livland, to his wife Christina Strom in Karlskrona. The letter opens with the salutation, actually I have this on the next slide, my little very dearest only friend and faithful spouse and my little heart, and goes on to say that, quote, since nothing in the world is so dear to me as you, my little Stina, who are my wedded wife and my little heart, I therefore let you know, my little heart, that I am now, God willing, in good health. This effusive style is maintained for the rest of an unusually long letter. I mean, many of these letters are actually very short, but this is quite a long one, in which endearments embellish almost every line. My little heart, and variants such as my very dearest little heart, appears at least 14 times. My angel and variants such as little angel appear at least a dozen times. There are also repeated iterations of my little Stina, my friend, my very dearest friend, and so on. Baga also worries that his expressive skills are unequal to the task of conveying his strong feelings for his wife. Thus, my very dearest darling, I miss you so much more than words can ever express. God is my witness. Now, it's unclear whether Baga wrote his own letter or dictated it to a scrivener, but if it was the latter, Baga must have been very accustomed to dictation, not something most people can easily do without practice then or now. He clearly succeeded in putting his own mark and personality on the letter, as well as conveying in unmistakable, if repetitive, terms, the depth of his feelings for his wife. No other letter sender adopted as extravagant an emotional style as Baga did, and as I said, the majority of the letters are also a good deal shorter. Still, most writers used quite feeling language with respect to their wives. Martin Beck, we've already heard from, who is a merchant sailor, and who likely dictated his letter, refers to his wife as my heart's dear wife and heart, as well as my best wife and friend, my good friend, and my little very best and most faithful friend. Johann Blom, an ordinary sailor on a merchant ship who also dictated his letter, addresses his wife some 10 times in the course of a one-page letter as my heart's dear wife. Abram Peterson Ritter, a merchant sailor, perhaps an officer who probably penned his own letter, managed to get in dearest wife and best friend 3 times in a relatively short letter. Even low-ranking sailors who dictated their letters, but who in practice seem to have had relatively little control over their content, still managed to convey a certain amount of emotion. Take, for example, 2 sailors named Anders Persson Lustig and Anders Elsman. Lustig and Elsman dictated their letters on 16 January, along with what seems to have been a crush of men waiting to avail themselves of the help of a scrivener. Lustig and Elsman were also pretty clearly seeking to save money, because they used just one piece of paper between them and had their letters put down on either side of the single page. Moreover, in most respects, the 2 letters are identical. So it's really clear that the scrivener was copying from a template. Even so, Lustig, despite the fact that the scrivener got confused at one point about which man he was writing for, and you get the impression that they were churning out letter after letter, and there was kind of a long line and jostling around. Still, Lustig managed to get in a greeting to his wife and little son and a request to his kära hustru to keep their baby son prettily, vackert in Swedish, which perhaps in this context means neat and clean. Elsman, in his part of the letter, got in the extra endearment min kära älskaliga kära hustru, perhaps translatable as my dearly beloved dear wife. And the repetition may be a scrivener's error, but it may also reflect Elsman's own dictated speech, at least at that moment. And you do get these little interpolations in these letters where even though they're from a template, all of a sudden the voice of the person dictating will break in. And this is not a new experience. Other people have noticed this, but it's nevertheless interesting to see. Clearly, the letters do not support the notion that early modern plebeian marriages were largely loveless and transactional. Still, even for those of us who never believed they were, the sheer number of endearments is striking. No one appears to have felt either hesitation or embarrassment about expressing strong affection for their wives, even if in what must have been the rather public context of dictating a letter. Of course, we may reasonably wonder to what extent these people's notions about and ways of expressing their love were unique to their time, place, and occupations. That large and interesting topic, versions of which have occupied many historians of emotion, I want, however, to leave aside today, because time is short, though we can certainly discuss it later if you want, because I have a few other issues to discuss. While the letters do showcase marital affection, or at least the expectation of it, we do need to ask whether this is the only or even the main goal of these letters. Were that the case, we might expect a prominent role for example, personal or family news or discussion about issues important to the couple's ongoing married life. There is certainly some of this in the letters, though almost exclusively in the longer letters that were probably written by officers. And in fact, many of the instances come from that one long letter by Samuel Bage that I showed you earlier. Thus, Samuel Bage informs his wife that he is resolved not to get in debt while he's away and that he is no longer drinking brandy wine. He also advises her to evict the current renters from their farmstead as soon as spring comes, especially, quote, the devil's bitch who lives in our baking shed. So they were having problems with their lodger. Several men do explicitly extend their love to their children, and a couple of men offer their wives advice on child rearing, like Anders Persson Lustig's remark about his wife keeping their son Vackert mentioned above. So there is this sort of material in the letters, but it's actually extraordinarily rare. And most letters don't have this kind of thing at all. One reason for this is certainly the repetitiveness of so many of the letters, especially those produced by scriveners for lower-ranking sailors. But the main reason is that so much space in the letters, whether scrivener produced or penned by the letter writer himself, is taken up with greetings from the sender and his shipmates to relatives and others in his or his wife's orbit, which is the topic to which I will now turn. The term networked emotion has gained popularity recently in several fields, including the history of emotion. It owes debts to a range of thinkers, including Durkheim, Bruno Latour, and most recently, Sarah Ahmed. And it is proved especially popular with people who study the social and emotional impact of digital media. There are a couple of reasons why it may be useful in the present context. First, it directs attention to the way social media, letters, or as in the present case, indirect messaging, sending messages by proxy, which I'll talk about in a second, can amplify and change the nature of the emotions as they move along diverse networks. Second, and following here particularly Sarah Ahmed's work on collective feelings in particular, it encourages us to pay particular attention to the mobilizing of ostensibly private affect, perhaps affect that we think of as private and they didn't necessarily, to support collective goals. So with this in mind, let us look more closely at these greetings. Helsa, the two dots over the A just mean it's instead of a. So Helsa is the second of the three Swedish terms I would like you to learn. Helsa. In Swedish, as in other Scandinavian languages, Helsa, the noun, and Helsa, the verb, are both heavy with meaning. They derive from older words that suggest both luck and happiness, and the noun form has a strong association with bodily welfare, health and well-being, as well as a more metaphorical link to spiritual health and salvation. They are closely related to the English word hail, as in hail fellow well met, and less certainly the English word hail, as in hail and hearty. In fact, the Old Norse loan word helsa lasted in English into the late Tudor period and longer in Scots, and may in fact have been still being used at least in Scotland in the late 17th century. Now, despite the fact that there are clear genealogical lines to be drawn between older and newer usages of this word helsa, and it's still used today, and its derivatives over the past 1,000 years or so, I nevertheless want to argue that, at least among these sailors and their wives, a different and perhaps unique affective project clung to the use of the term helsa than is the case today. In the 1696 letters, the noun helsa is often found quite soon after the salutation in the stereotyped phrase, "Therefore I thank God for my good health." So tackar jag Gud för en god hälsa. Or later on in the greeting section in the form, "He is in health," han vid hälsa. The other main usage of helsa is verbal, or at least part of a verb phrase. It can be used to wish others well, in a sense partway between greeting someone and wishing them good health, or it can mean the act of wishing a different positive emotion on someone. The most common emotions people wish upon each other, at least in the 1696 letters, are joy, Freud, gladness or happiness, glädje, or good days and nights, goda dagar och nätter. And you don't really need to repeat them, but the third and last set of Swedishisms that I want you to hold in your mind is these three positive emotions: Freud, joy, glädje, gladness or happiness, and goda dagar och nätter, good days and nights, which I love because I'm kind of an insomniac. So good days and nights seems like a very nice emotional state to me. In the 1696 letters, helsa, the verb, generally appears as an imperative or as part of an imperative phrase, most often directed at one's wife, whose job it is to helsa, wish someone well, or to låta hälsa, convey good wishes or encourage a positive emotion in someone, often on behalf of a third person. Thus, we get phrases like the following, which I've got up on the board, on the PowerPoint here. "Dear wife, go to sailmaster Jonas's wife and wish her very well from him. He is also in good health." I won't go through the Swedish, but you can see it up there. In the 1696 letters, good wishes take up a significant amount of the available space, up to half the letter in some cases. They take the form either of greetings that come directly from the main letter sender to other people he knows, or, as shown above by the sailmaker Jonas example, they are greetings inserted into the letter from shipmates of the main letter sender and intended for their relatives, most often for their wives or other acquaintances. In both cases, the letter's recipient, usually the primary letter sender's wife, is tasked with finding the person or persons named and delivering the greeting, presumably in person. Reciprocity is a key feature of most of these greetings, and it was important both to convey good wishes, hälsa, often in the form of wishing the recipient joy, happiness, and many good days and nights, and to state that the person sending the message was alive and well, vid hälsa, at least at the time he voiced or penned the greeting. In fact, several letters try to pin this down further by writing well and in good health up to this day and hour, vid en god hälsa och sundhet ju till denna dag och stund, which sounds slightly ominous to me, but clearly it's an attempt to, kind of pin down the moment, as it were. If we add up all the relatives, friends, and others that individual letter writers wanted to convey good wishes to, plus the men who wanted greetings to be conveyed on their behalf, plus the wives, mothers, sisters, in-laws, and so on they wanted to greet, over 250 additional people, not including uncountable groups such as children, all the neighbors, or all good friends, jostle for emotional space in the 40 letters sent by non-elite men. Take, for example, a letter written by Master Gunner Anders Liljeqvist to his wife Marianne Jönsdotter in Karlskrona. The letter is conventional. It uses standard openings and closings, and the body of the letter cribs descriptive material from other letters. Liljeqvist addresses my dear wife and child, min kära hustru och barn, several times, but otherwise offers little that is personal. However, a large part of the letter is devoted to the greetings, and this is the part that is most individualized and, in fact, exciting. 5 are Liljeqvist's own wishes to be conveyed by his wife to 5 different men and their wives. There is also a general greeting or shout out to all good friends, alla goda vänner, and then another 6 greetings come from shipmates or friends from other ships. I reproduce just 2 of those here, these what I call proxy greetings. The first, Carl English on the ship Gotland sends hearty well wishes to you and to his wife and his brother Jöns, and he is in good health. You can see the reciprocal thing here. And the second one, Thomas Roca wishes his father and mother 1,000 joys, wish my little children 1,000 good days and nights. And note here the shift from the third to the first person as the scrivener, or Liljeqvist, I'm actually not sure who wrote this one down, writes down his words. And again, very typical of dictated letters. In toto, in the Liljeqvist letter, the greetings take up more than half of the letter, in fact. A letter sent by Master Gunner Mads Frank to his wife Margareta Månsdotter, also in Karlskrona, looks very similar, and it gives a good sense of the demands these letters put upon wives, which I was actually written about in a different article. The letter was dictated to a scrivener, and it is very short. I don't actually have a slide for it. In it, Frank offers good wishes to be delivered by his wife to 3 other sailors, perhaps former shipmates, and a general greeting to alla goda vänner, all good friends. He devotes 5 more lines to a complicated request from one Hagen, obviously another shipmate, who wanted Margaret Månsdotter to visit his wife and encourage or pressure him to write to his sister in Sundsta, which is far off in central Sweden, and let her know he was well. In addition to the oral greetings, letters meant for 2 other under-officers' wives were inserted into Margareta Månsdotter's envelope, presumably once again to save postage, and Frank uses another 2 lines to urge her to hand-deliver those letters quickly. Somewhere in the midst of the greetings and the hand delivery requests, Frank remembers to tell his wife, don't forget to wish yourself and Henrik, presumably their son, many hundreds of thousands of joys. The aim of the historian, writes Rob Bodis, is not to understand emotions per se, but rather how they were experienced, what aroused them, in what form, and with what effects. So in the last third of the talk, see what time it is now. Let me take a stab at doing those things. Seafaring had a reputation for being a dangerous occupation. Just looking at incidental reportage in the 1696 letters, we hear of severe storms in the North Sea, accompanied by 5 deaths on the warship Livland. Exactly what the men died of is unclear. 2 men shot to pieces during the flag dispute. along with, or so it was rumored on the Swedish side, 6 Englishmen killed in the same altercation and 15 injured, probably exaggerated, but. In addition, one of the Swedish merchant ships ran aground near Plymouth and her cargo was lost, though the crew survived, while another was wrecked, also coming into Plymouth Harbor, and 5 out of the 9 members of the crew and the captain drowned. Dramatic maritime mishaps generated a lot of talk, as they still do today, but staying home was not appreciably safer. Karlskrona, Kalmar, Stockholm, and Gothenburg, where all of these men's wives lived, had the high mortality rates we expect of most early modern towns and cities. They were also garrison towns, which is seldom a good thing for local mortality rates. And there was a lot of warfare in the 17th century. So, you know, these towns were subjected to wave after wave of epidemic diseases. Moreover, Sweden, like the other Nordic lands and northern Scotland, tended to have higher mortality rates and more subsistence crises than more southerly climes due to the cold and the very short growing season. Indeed, during the crisis or near crisis decade of the 1690s, when one poor harvest succeeded another, the crude death rate per 1,000 within the borders of present-day Sweden rose for a time to well over 40 per 1,000, with local spikes exceeding 70 per 1,000. And those were not plague years. This was just harvest failures. The writers of the 1696 letters were therefore very familiar with death, though not necessarily more reconciled to it than modern people are. They also tended to attribute much more power to words than most people do today. Thus, most of them would have assumed that prayer had at least some power to ward off evil and ill health, and they probably also believed that group prayer had more power than individual prayer, which is why Swedish monarchs, in common with monarchs of every faith across Europe in the early modern period, tried to quell pestilence, drought, and enemy invasion by calling for national days of repentance, fasting, and prayer. However, the greetings in these letters were not prayers, but wishes. And though God often was invoked in the letters, most often it was not in relation to the greetings. Still, the ritualized character of these acts of wishing other people well as the amount of space they take up and the effort they demand, particularly from the women on the other end, suggests that more power was ascribed to well-wishing than its rather rote character in the present day might suggest. It was, I would argue, a different affective experience than, say, sending or receiving a Christmas card today, and it had a different and more expansive goal. I want to argue that people saw these exhortations to health, joy, and good days and nights as having actual or at least potential power to ward off sickness, ill luck, and death. Moreover, this is congruent with the impulse to multiply the power of their good wishes by larger and larger numbers. 1,000 good days and nights, 1,000 goda dagar nätter, 100,000 joys, 1,000,000 greetings. 1,000 million joys is the highest number. But 1,000 million is a lot. It would also help to explain their often collective character. Just as with a day of special prayer, when more people participated in these wish fests, it amplified their power for good. There were also magical or quasi-magical elements to the greetings themselves. One of the most striking, which I've already mentioned, inheres in the way these greetings seek both to effect action at a distance and to transcend time and space. As I indicated earlier, almost all the greetings say, in effect, I am well, and it is my wish that at this moment, even though we are apart, you are well too. People, or at least their emotions, come suddenly face to face on the page, even though one bundle of emotions is sitting in Plymouth Harbor and the other is at, say, Karlskrona. 3 of the Livland sailors even added a little rhyming charm or wish to their dictated letters to underscore this virtual encounter. In the 3 dictated letters, it runs roughly, I'll say it in Swedish so you can catch the somewhat labored rhyme. Farvel allesammans det vore mig till mycket gaman att jag kunde finna eder där I så god hälsa som jag which is farewell everybody. It would give me great joy if I could find you there in as good health as I am here. So you can see it's exactly the same structurally as the greetings. Each of these probably semi-literate men, all of these were dictated, and they were the kind of standard template dictated ones, which suggests to me that they probably couldn't read or write very well. Each of these men delivered from memory a slightly different variant of the charm, which suggests that it was traditional and derived from oral culture. Probably the rhyme reflected older ways by which evil-averting messages were transmitted orally from one person to another, when friends or shipmates were still the main medium of transmission and letters were uncommon. Apparently, though, this oral element had moved over readily into the plebeian culture of letter sending, something that will not surprise anyone who studies early modern epistolary cultures, including those of better off people, where there's, again, often oral elements that make it into the letter. So imagine two scenes. In the first, set in Plymouth Harbor, 80 or more Scandinavian ships wait for the wind to turn. The Sankt Jakob is expected to leave soon for the north, and with the drive for letters in full swing, men fight for time with a scrivener. The Navy men are likely crowded below decks. It is a cold January, and the clerk scriveners are clearly feeling rushed. Men from the merchant ships, most of which are too small to have dedicated clerks, scramble around looking for scribal assistance, perhaps rowing over to other ships to find it. And one of the ways you can tell this is some of the letters are actually dictated in other languages, which are mutually intelligible. So they'll be written in Danish, even though it's clearly a Swedish person dictating. So you're really having trouble finding people to write letters for them. Other men who did not have the free time or who lacked the money to send their own letter negotiate to get their messages into other people's letters. Everything is public and everything is on display, including the things people say about their wives. Then conjure up what would have happened if the letters had not been seized by the Royal Navy fire ship and had actually fetched up in Karlskrona, Kalmar, Stockholm, or Gothenburg. They would have set off a flurry of activity. Some letters would have been hand-delivered, usually by wives, and the letters would somehow have gotten read, sometimes with the help of local businessmen, or with the more literate wives reading them out to some of the less educated ones, a potent form of informal patronage. Nothing would have been secret, and both the tone and tenor of men's messages to their wives and to others would have been obvious to all. Many of the greetings would have required going about town locating people, perhaps with a letter in hand. In the process, old friendships would have been renewed, rivalries smoothed over, and new social connections made. No doubt the atmosphere would have been celebratory, and resources permitting would have included food and drink. After all, the letters emphasize over and over again that they aim to spread health, welfare, and joy. Tens of thousands of joys, in fact. The first of these descriptions is pretty true to what really happened. The other is based on the plentiful evidence within the letters themselves about what their senders intended to happen on the other end. Both reflect the collective as well as the highly networked character of these letters' production and anticipated reception. But there were also many collective elements to the greetings themselves. This is sort of my last point. And if this whole operation is to be seen as a collective ritual, which I argue it should be, these would have had particular importance. The most common object of greetings after the man's wife is all good friends, alla goda vänner, which appears in one variant or another in almost half the letters. One can interpret it both as an effort to spread the joy and the magic as widely as possible, and as an invitation to a sailor's wife to decide, based on current conditions, who it was most politic to favor with a greeting. Group greetings also went in the other direction. As we have seen, some men sent group greetings to their wives from their comrades or from named groups of friends. Johann Olafsson wrote his wife, quote, "You are greeted by all your friends in the fleet. However, they are too many to count." Almost all the greetings demanded action from wives, but some of the letters are especially explicit about mobilizing wives' enthusiasm for the larger project of distributing health, welfare, and joy. Thus, Master Gunnar Burish Spring informed his wife that, quote, "Everybody among both the under and the over officers of the Livland is in good health, undoubtedly with the expectation that his wife would carry the good news to the other officers' wives." Johann Blom, from a merchant ship, offers an especially direct articulation of the impulse to mobilize, the importance of married couples to the whole operation, and the way these greetings try for a magical moment to transcend time and space. Blom wanted his wife to, quote, "Go to all the other wives who have their men here on the ship and wish them many thousand good wishes, and they," that is the men on the ship, "are all in good health." The whole edifice of wishes and well-wishing by proxy depended for all practical purposes on networks of married couples, and clearly married people derived prestige from them. But as I have argued here, their larger purpose as they moved from person to letter to person to other persons was to mobilize people to speak and enact over and over again the evil-averting wish that Helsa represented, and to do so, at least symbolically, tens or hundreds or thousands or even millions of times. As such, they bore more resemblance to a collective day of prayer than to a marriage of two souls. They also enact a set of feelings, a goal-oriented affect that has, to a large extent, been lost. To conclude, these greetings did a lot of other work that there is not time to detail here. They were never just a collective ritual. For example, many greetings were clearly intended to reinforce connections to shipmates and superior officers from previous voyages, a potential pipeline to future employment opportunities. They could also smooth the way for sailors' wives trying to work through the Navy and merchant marine bureaucracies, and you can see this in some of the people that get greeted. In short, they worked in some of the standard ways that symbolic capital does. But here I have gone farther to argue that the greetings were actively networked emotions as well as being magical in the sense of being an attempt to effect action at a distance by supernatural means. Now, to say something was magical, and I'm being a bit deliberately provocative here, begs the question of what its relationship was to religion, especially since early modern state-centered Swedish Lutheranism was both fairly strict and actively hostile both to magic and to at least some lay collective celebrations when they got too out of hand or were surrounded around church, the usual kinds of things. In fact, the clergy are completely absent from these non-elite letters. No one ever greets a clergyman, or priest, as they were and still are referred to in Sweden, and no one ever even mentions one. Moreover, the emphasis on joy and happiness strike one as quite different from the guilt-inducing fare of national days of prayer and repentance, pretty much everywhere, including in Sweden. If anything, the main priests in this story are married women, and the miracle they oversee is the bridging of distance at the heart of the reciprocal act of greeting someone, particularly someone on someone else's behalf. This does not, of course, mean that the greeting system was wholly secular. References to God are frequent in the letters. It's the 17th century after all. People thank God, call upon God to protect them and their loved ones, and look nervously over their shoulders in case they should inadvertently offend him. And anybody who's read 17th century stuff in English is exactly the same thing. However, the fact that neither God nor priests have much, or in the case of priests, any role with respect to these greetings, suggests that the creatively networked feelings the letters tried to evoke, the collective rituals they sought to mobilize, were a purely lay effort to harness the magical power of the word, both in its written and oral form. No one in the mid-1690s would have been so foolish as to think that anything humans did could definitively secure their own or their loved one's life and health, still less their happiness and joy. But these letters show us one way that a group of 17th century sailors and their wives tried to supplement the standard measures with some joyful collective rituals of their own, partly in hopes that, God willing, it might make some small difference toward keeping themselves and their families safe and happy. Thank you.